At 9:12 on the morning of June 6th in the year 1944, Marine Derek Cakebread dropped into cold water that rose to his chest just off Queen Red sector of Sword Beach, and the first thing he saw were long bright streaks of German machine gun fire skipping across the top of waves toward the landing craft behind him, as if the sea itself had turned into a field of sparks, and he felt the weight of his equipment pulling at him while he fought to stay upright in the violent surf. And in that moment he understood he was stepping into a kind of war he had only heard about in training, and nothing in his 22 years had prepared him for how real it suddenly felt, because he had spent 2 full years in the Royal Marines, yet he had never taken a life, and now the Germans had filled this stretch of coast with hundreds of machine guns supported by dozens of mortars, and many heavy artillery guns all arranged to tear apart anyone who dared approach the sand. And during the first hour alone, many British commandos would die before their boots ever touched dry ground. But Cakebread was not supposed to live this kind of life, because just 2 years earlier he had been Barber in Tottenham in North London, cutting hair for factory workers and shopkeepers and old men who argued about football and weather, and wanted their sideburns even and neat. And he had always been the quiet, steady-handed type, the one who noticed small details and straight lines and slight imperfections that no one else saw, and none of that mattered when conscription papers arrived in March of 1942. Which ordered him to report for service whether he wanted to or not, and the Royal Marines took him simply because the nation needed bodies to fill the ranks as the war burned. Through its soldiers, faster than replacements, could be trained, and Cakebread expected to become just another basic Marine, learning drills and rifle handling, and being part of large groups of men who all moved and fired on command without much thought beyond survival. But then something unusual happened in the final months of 1942, when the quartermaster handed him a wooden crate and told him to sign for it, and inside was an American P-14 sniper rifle fitted with a telescopic sight, and Cakebread had never asked for such a weapon, and he had never requested sniper duty. And yet someone in the battalion must have looked at his civilian trade and decided a barber with steady hands and careful eyes might make a precision shooter, so within a few days he was loaded onto a truck headed to the sniper school in South Wales, where the British Army trained its marksmen. The other trainees were hunters and competitive shooters and men who had spent their youth shooting game across wide fields, while he was nothing more than a quiet London hairdresser who had never fired at anything living, and he quickly learned the instructors did not care who he had been because they cared only about accuracy, discipline, and results. And for 6 long weeks he was shaped into something new as he studied zeroing grouping distance, judging camouflage, stalking, field firing, and all the invisible arts of patience and stillness and calculation. And in Wales he learned to lie motionless under nets smeared with mud until insects crawled across his skin, and he learned to read wind through grass and trees, and he learned how to breathe so slowly that his pulse steadied the rifle instead of shaking it. And he discovered that years behind a barber chair had actually prepared him for this strange profession, because he already knew how to stand still for hours, how to watch small movements, how to calm himself, and how to work with careful precision. And by the end of the course he was one of the best shots in his class, though he also understood that hitting targets in a quiet Welsh valley meant nothing when compared to facing real enemies who had waited and fired back with deadly intent. And then in 1943, the 5th Battalion Royal Marines was dissolved, and its men scattered into new units being formed for the coming invasion of Europe, and Cakebread was sent to 45 Royal Marine Commando, an elite assault force trained for impossible missions behind enemy lines. And when he arrived at the training centre in the Scottish Highlands, he faced the brutal commando course at Anisbury, where men who failed were sent back to ordinary units in shame, and men who quit were marked forever as cowards, and the instructors used live ammunition during exercises, and some trainees died during training, and all of this hardened Cakebread in ways he had never expected. And after he passed the course he moved on to advanced skills like deer stalking, with gamekeepers learning to track through wild country without leaving signs, and learning to make himself vanish in terrain filled with wet bracken, sharp wind, and cold rain. And slowly the barber from Tottenham transformed into one of the quiet, deadly specialists the commandos needed for their most dangerous tasks, and by the spring of 1944 he was part of the sniper section of the 1st Special Service Brigade under Brigadier Lord Lovehat, one of the most famous officers in the British Army, and on June 5th, Cakebread boarded a landing craft at Warash and cleaned his Lee Enfield No. 4 Mark 1T rifle for the last time before battle, a weapon fitted with a No. 32 scope offering 3.5 times magnification and capable of putting 7 shots inside a circle the width of a hand at 200 yards. And when dawn finally arrived on June 6, 1944, the invasion that would shape the fate of the world began, and somewhere hidden along the coast, German snipers were already waiting for men like him as the landing craft ground against a sandbar at 9:08. And the ramp fell, and he stepped into the water with his rifle raised over his head, hoping he would make it to shore alive. Around Cakebread, the men of 45 Commando pushed through the freezing water toward the beach, while explosions turned the shoreline into a haze of smoke, mud, and shattered steel, and the sound of machine guns cut through the air with a sharpness that drowned out every shouted order and sword. Beach was never meant to be this deadly, because the naval bombardment had pounded the German strongpoints since 5:30 that morning, and rockets had streaked overhead in their hundreds, and bombers had released thousands of tons of explosives onto fortifications that intelligence officers claimed would be crushed or nearly silent by the time the commandos landed. Yet the truth became clear the moment Cakebread reached the shallows, because the German gunners had survived deep inside concrete bunkers, and now they poured fire onto the incoming troops without hesitation, and mortar shells burst in the rising tide, sending pillars of water into the sky and shrapnel into the backs of men who struggled to stay upright under heavy packs. And he watched a Marine just a few paces to his left drop silently beneath the water without even making a sound as a bullet struck him. And the brigade that followed Cakebread ashore had landed nearly 90 minutes after the first assault, waves which meant the beach should have been secured, but instead he found himself stepping into a scene of destruction where burning vehicles littered the sand and tangled barbed wire trapped the wounded, and noise roared so loudly it seemed to shake the inside of his skull, and Sherman tanks lay crippled where mines had torn off their tracks, while medics dragged bleeding men toward fragments of seawall or overturned metal that offered the smallest hint of cover. And Cakebread reminded himself that his task was not to fight here but to survive this nightmare and move inland to join the 6th Airborne Division that held the bridges over the Orne River and the Cannes Canal, because those crossings were the key to the entire eastern side of the invasion. And if the Germans reclaimed them, the Allies could be driven back into the sea, and everything gained on this day would collapse, and the commandos gathered near the seawall before advancing east toward a place called Wiam, and Brigadier Lord Lovat strode at the head of the column while his piper Bill Millen played the bagpipes boldly as bullets cracked overhead, a sound so defiant it brought a strange calm to men on the edge of panic, and the troops followed the haunting music through broken streets filled with rubble-shattered glass dust smoke, and the bodies of soldiers who had fallen only moments earlier, and Cakebread moved with a troop carrying his rifle across his back because the fighting here was too close for sniper work, and German soldiers darted through doorways or windows, firing bursts from their machine pistols, then vanishing before anyone could respond with precision. And the brigade reached the bridges at a village called Benouville by early afternoon, where airborne troops had taken both crossings during a daring glider attack the previous night, and had held them under fierce counterattacks for nearly half a day. And when Lord Lovat arrived, he apologized in a famously calm way for being 2.5 minutes late, though there was no time to rest because German forces were pressing hard from the east and meant to crush the Allied bridgehead before reinforcements arrived, and the commandos crossed the Orne River and turned north toward Franceville-Plage, which was their assigned objective, but they never reached it because at roughly 3 in the afternoon, new orders arrived from brigade headquarters stating that resistance was too strong around Ampherville and La Plaine, and that the commandos must dig in to hold the high ground instead of advancing farther. And Cakebread and his unit established positions around the Chateau d'Ampherville, a stone manor that overlooked long stretches of farmland and fields of hedge and orchards, and from this ground they could see the village of Breville to the east, still held firmly by German troops, and to the south the 9th Parachute Battalion clung to Chateau Saint-Come with fewer than 200 exhausted men, and the British had created what they called the Orne Bridge, had a narrow strip of contested earth roughly 5 kilometers deep and 8 kilometers wide, and within this thin, prolonged space, 12,000 British soldiers faced units from 3 German divisions, and this patch of Normandy would become for 3 months one of the most violent landscapes on earth, because artillery fell, daily infantry assaulted nightly, and between the lines in the thick hedge and broken barn snipers on both sides hunted each other with relentless patience and precision, and this was the kind of war that Derek Cakebread had been trained for, not the chaos of the surf or the house-to-house fighting, but the quiet, calculated work of spotting a target, measuring the distance, and firing one perfect shot before slipping away unseen. And that evening, after a day that felt like a lifetime, he cleaned his rifle by the fading light, preparing for the next dawn, and his weapon was zeroed for 300 yards, and in his ammunition pouch he carried 50 rounds of carefully chosen .303 cartridges, and his Denison smock would help him blend into the Normandy hedge as he crawled into the earth and waited for movement, and somewhere out there German snipers were making the same preparations, and the Orne bridgehead was about to transform into a deadly ground for both hunter and hunted, and within days this former barber from Tottenham would begin building a tally that would make him one of the most effective snipers in the entire Normandy campaign. But first, he had to survive the night as German artillery began to range in on the commando positions, firing shells that crept closer with each volley, and before dawn on June 7th, the Germans attacked with another barrage at 4:15, followed by waves of infantry from the 857th Grenadier Regiment, and the paratroopers and commandos held firm, though they took heavy casualties, and their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Ree, had already fallen to a sniper on D-Day struck in the leg. While moving between the bridges, and Major Nicole Gray had taken over command, and this was the world Cakebread entered as the long, brutal sniper war truly began. The death of Lieutenant Colonel Ree from a single sniper round on D-Day itself reminded every man in the Orne bridgehead that the German marksmen watching them were skilled, patient, and ruthless, and that they could strike at any moment without warning. And for the first 2 days, Cakebread had no chance to work as a sniper because the situation along the line was too unstable, and the enemy kept attacking from several directions, so every rifle was needed just to hold the perimeter, and the men slept in short half-hour shifts inside shallow trenches and ate cold rations when they could, and the sky constantly flashed with artillery as the Germans tried to break the defensive line before it fully solidified. But by June 8th, the front had steadied just enough for the brigade to organize its snipers into a unified section, and the officer responsible for gathering them was Lieutenant Brian Seagram, the brigade intelligence officer, who would later write about these days in his history, titled Commando Men, and he called in pairs of trained snipers from each commando unit, bringing them together into a single team that would roam the front, collect intelligence, track movements, and eliminate targets when the opportunity made it worthwhile. And Cakebread was paired with Marine Tommy Treacher, a fellow sniper from a troop of 45 Commando, and both men had trained together at the tough commando school at Achnakari, and understood each other's signals, moods, and silent warnings without speaking a word. And their first mission began at 5 in the morning on June 9th, when Lieutenant Seagram briefed them and ordered them to pass through the positions of 3 Commando, then crawl roughly 800 yards into the uncertain ground between the armies to set up an observation post near a place called Long Mare Farm, and their task was to record German movements on the network of roads beyond the front lines, report how effective the British artillery strikes were, and take any viable shot that might slow or disrupt the enemy, and targets of opportunity meant human beings. Cakebread understood that even as he checked his scope and slung his rifle across his shoulder, and he and Treacher moved out before sunrise, crawling through hedges wet with dew and mud that clung to their sleeves, and the Normandy countryside revealed itself as a bewildering maze of small fields, separated by thick hedgerows, sunken lanes, old stone walls, orchards, and patches of tall grass that had grown for years without being touched by war. And this terrain was perfect for snipers because every hedge could hide a shooter, and every patch of shadow could become a hunter or a victim. And they reached their planned location and built 2 hide positions 20 yards apart, close enough for mutual support, but far enough that a single mortar round would not kill them both. and Cakebread settled into a shallow dip beneath a hedge, pulled his netting over his head and shoulders, and began the long still wait that was the heart of his craft, and no sniper could afford to move too soon or shift for comfort, because even the smallest disturbance could give away a position and end the mission, and patience here was not simply a virtue, it was survival. And for 3 hours nothing presented itself as German trucks rolled along distant roads and soldiers moved around villages in the distance, but none came close enough to justify the risk of firing and revealing a hide. And then a little after 9:30, Cakebread saw motion near a farmhouse 400 yards to the east, where a German officer stepped from behind a stone wall and lifted binoculars to scan the British lines, and Cakebread recognized the moment instantly because the officer was performing reconnaissance for a possible attack. And if allowed to finish, he could bring down artillery or infantry on the British positions, and Cakebread adjusted the number 32 scope and calculated the bullet drop for 400 yards, which was roughly 18 inches for a 303 round. And then he placed the crosshairs on the center of the officer's chest, steadied his breathing, and pulled the trigger with the practiced smooth pressure he had repeated thousands of times in training, and the rifle kicked against his shoulder, and the officer fell without drama, simply dropping as if someone had cut the strings that held him upright. And since sound traveled slowly at that range, the bullet struck long before anyone nearby heard the shot, and Cakebread was already crawling backward through the hedge, knowing the Germans would search for the source and likely blanket the suspected area with mortar fire. And he signaled the kill to Treacher, then shifted toward their secondary hide and waited for danger to fade, and this was the first German Cakebread killed in Normandy, and it marked the beginning of a lethal pattern that would repeat again and again in the weeks that followed. And each morning before sunrise, Cakebread and Treacher would slip through the forward lines carrying only their rifles, ammunition, water, and a single meal, because anything heavier could slow them in moments when speed meant the difference between life and death. And they would remain hidden for 6 to 8 hours, watching German positions, noting troop concentrations, and waiting for that one perfect shot that was worth the risk of being discovered. And as darkness neared, they always pulled back to British lines, because the Germans owned the night in those early days, and their patrols moved with deadly skill through the darkness, and even the best trained commandos avoided moving after dusk, and the sniper section understood these rhythms and survived by following them. And within a few days, Cakebread found himself settling into the strange calm of the sniper role, where the world narrowed to breathe heartbeats, mirrors of light, and distant human gestures. And he learned to read fields like pages and hedges like lines of text, and he began to think of each day as a silent duel between hunters separated by yards of earth and layers of stillness, each waiting for the other to blink. And every shot he took weighed heavily on him, yet he accepted each one as part of the brutal reality of this frontier, where hesitation or mercy could mean the death of his troop and the death of the men he had trained beside and shared trenches with since the invasion began. And by the end of this first stretch, Cakebread understood fully that he was no longer simply a Marine from Tottenham with a sharp eye, but a sniper in one of the most dangerous killing grounds of the entire war. The Orne bridgehead settled into a grim stillness as both armies realized neither had the strength to break through, and so the war along this narrow strip of land turned into a slow, brutal exchange of artillery, mortar fire, and sniper duels that lasted day after day and night after night. Cakebread learned the land as if it were a map etched into his mind, knowing every ditch, every gap in the hedges, every burnt barn that offered a slit of shadow deep enough to hide a rifle barrel. And he memorized which farmhouses the Germans used as command posts, which dirt roads carried them, resupply trucks, and which patches of open ground they tried to cross when shifting troops between positions. And he also learned where their snipers hunted, because many of them were veterans of the Eastern Front, where the war between German and Soviet marksmen had created some of the deadliest shooters alive, and these men moved with patience and cold calculation, using camouflage that blended seamlessly into the soil. And they fired only once before disappearing into a new hiding place, and their experience was deeper than anything learned in training. And on June 11th, Cakebread came within inches of death when he was observing a road junction near Breville, and a sudden whip of air sliced past his ear as a round cracked into the hedge behind him, and he had not seen the muzzle flash, nor the glint of glass, nor the shape of a rifle, which meant the German sniper had spotted him. First, and he froze because any movement would confirm his exact location, and he knew the enemy was watching the place where his head had been only seconds earlier, waiting for him to shift or breathe too hard or brush a leaf. And for 20 long minutes he lay motionless, pressed into the earth, while sweat soaked through his uniform and insects crawled across his cheek and the sun beat down on his back. And only then did he begin to crawl backward inch by inch, keeping the hedge between himself and the unseen enemy, and it took him 2 full hours to withdraw 300 yards to where treachery waited with tension written across his face. And when Cakebread finally reached him, he was shaking from the near miss, and the experience hardened him in a way no instructor ever could. And from that day, he selected his hides more carefully, choosing positions that allowed multiple exits and fewer sightlines that an enemy sniper could exploit, and he never stayed in one place for 2 long shifting hides every hour or whenever instinct whispered a warning. And he understood that the man who had nearly killed him was as skilled and focused as he was, and that meant the duel between them would continue as long as both survived. And by the middle of June, Cakebread had reached double digits in confirmed kills, though each kill came quietly with no glory and rarely with witnesses, because he always fired a single shot, then melted back into cover before the Germans could react, and his shots found machine gunners adjusting their belts, mortarmen who stood too long with a shell in hand, and officers bending over maps or shouting orders. And Lord Love had noticed these results because the brigadier made a point of learning which of his men shaped the battle from the shadows, and the report from Lieutenant Seagram regularly mentioned Cakebread, and in his later memoir titled March Past Love, had wrote about the psychological weight that British snipers placed on German morale in the Breville sector, describing how enemy officers avoided open ground and soldiers walked crouched and hurried their movements and refused to linger anywhere that felt exposed because they feared the unseen rifle watching them from the hedge. And in this way, Cakebread was not only killing individual men, but also slowing and disrupting the entire enemy force, and this influence mattered as much as Bull. Because every German who hesitated was a small victory for the commandos, and yet the Germans adapted to the threat and brought in more of their seasoned snipers to duel with the British marksmen, and they increased mortar fire on suspected sniper nests, and established lookout posts meant solely to watch for flashes or movement that might reveal a rifle's hiding place. And on June 13th, the 857th Grenadier Regiment launched a major attack, and the morning began with the heaviest artillery barrage Cakebread had faced since D-Day, with shells smashing the earth for 90 relentless minutes, turning the fields around Amphoeville into a wasteland of craters, broken trees, and drifting smoke. And when the barrage finally lifted, German infantry advanced through the haze in large numbers, believing the defenders had been crushed, but the commandos had endured inside their slit trenches, and when the Germans emerged through the dust, they met a wall of rifle and Bren gun fire, and Cakebread had no chance to work as a sniper in this chaos, and instead fired as fast as he could work the bolt, dropping magazine after magazine into the dirt while shouting voices, and explosions shook the earth around him. And when the attack collapsed, the ground in front of the British line was littered with German dead, and the survivors limped back toward Breville, leaving their wounded crying in the open fields. And that night Cakebread cleaned his rifle by the dim glow of a covered lantern and counted his remaining ammunition, which had dwindled to 14 rounds of match grade, 3.0, 3 and 40 rounds of standard ball, because the resupply convoy was overdue, and no one knew when more would arrive. And beyond the darkness, German snipers were preparing for the next day, and for the deadly invisible war that continued even when the wider battle fell silent. And then the brutal struggle for Breville began on the night of June 12th. And everything in the region shifted again. The battle for Breville began on the night of June 12th, and the village stood like a dagger pointed into the heart of the Orne Bridge head, because from its high ground the Germans could look directly into British positions and direct artillery onto the bridges at Benuville, the glider landing zones at Ranville, and the scattered defences around Amphoeville. And as long as the enemy held Breville, no one in the bridge head was safe, and Major General Richard Gale, who commanded the 6th Airborne Division, knew this truth well, so he gathered every unit he could spare to take the village no matter the cost. And the assault force included the 12th Parachute Battalion D Company of the 12th Devonshire Regiment, a squadron of Sherman tanks from the 13th 18th Royal Hussars, and the fire support of several artillery regiments that filled the fields behind them, and at around 10 in the evening, the British guns opened with a roar that shook the ground where Cakebread lay beside his rifle in the commando positions, watching orange flashes on the horizon while the earth trembled like rolling thunder. And then the infantry advanced across 400 yards of open ground, walking straight into German machine gun fire and mortar blasts that burst in thick patterns across the fields, and the defenders had survived the bombardment inside deep bunkers. And now they poured out firing with a desperation that came from knowing they held the key to the entire flank, and both sides suffered terribly as the paratroopers and Devonshires pushed uphill over bodies and burning equipment. And when the crossroads at the center of Breville finally fell to the British, the cost was horrific because C Company of the 12th Parachute Battalion had been reduced to only 18 men who could still fight, and in the Chaos Brigadier, Lord Lovat was wounded by shrapnel from a shell that exploded near his observation point, and he was evacuated to England the next day, leaving command of the 1st Special Service Brigade to Brigadier Derek Mills Roberts, a seasoned veteran who had laid 6 commando ashore on D-Day. And though the British claimed the village, the struggle did not end because German counterattacks came again and again across the ruined fields, and each one was beaten back with fewer and fewer British reserves, and by the time the enemy finally gave up their attempt, the Orne bridgehead had survived, but at a terrible cost because the 6th Airborne Division had lost nearly half its strength in the first 2 weeks of the invasion, and several battalions barely existed beyond their names on paper. And for Cakebread, the fall of Breville changed his work entirely, because now that the British held the ridge, they could see deeper into German territory, and the sniper section gained new areas to hunt and new roadways to watch. And on June 15th, Cakebread and Tretcher moved farther east than they had ever gone, passing through the shattered ruins of Breville, where bodies and broken vehicles lay scattered across streets and gardens, and they reached a hedge overlooking the road to Traun, one of the main routes the Germans used for reinforcements and supply, and they set up their position before the sun had risen fully and waited with the patience of stone for their chance. And at 9:45 they saw a German Kubelwagen speeding along the road kicking up dust, but Cakebread let it pass because a single vehicle was not worth revealing a hide that could be used for far more critical targets. And 20 minutes later they spotted a tightly bunched convoy of 3 trucks filled with infantry escorted by an armored car, and the vehicles moved too fast and too close together for the narrow road. And the lead driver never expected a sniper to be watching from 200 yards away, hidden in a hedge, and Cakebread aimed for the driver because killing him would throw the entire convoy into chaos, and he squeezed the trigger, fired, then worked the bolt smoothly and fired again before the first shot had even reached its target. And the truck swerved violently and plowed into a ditch, and soldiers tumbled from the back while the following vehicles braked hard, unsure of what had hit them, and Cakebread and Tretcher were already crawling into a drainage channel, leaving the Germans behind firing blindly into the hedgerows. And by the end of June, Cakebread's confirmed kills had passed 20, and he had become one of the most effective and feared snipers in the 1st Special Service Brigade because few men could match his patience, his ability to stay still for hours, or his instinct for choosing the perfect moment to fire. And the Germans knew a deadly marksman was hunting them even if they did not know his name or face, and they whispered about a ghost who killed with single shots from impossible distances, and they forbade their officers from walking in the open or carrying binoculars or maps where they might be seen, and they doubled the guards on command posts, and still the killings continued because Cakebread had mastered the land and the rhythm of the enemy, and he turned the hedgerows of Normandy into a quiet killing ground. And yet the static war could not last forever, because by early July the Allied breakout was coming, and Operation Goodwood would send British armour crashing through the German lines east of Keene, and when that happened the slow, patient work of the sniper would be replaced by fast-moving chaos, and the question hanging over Cakebread was whether he would survive long enough to see the change. And July came with cold rain, deep mud, and the same exhausting war as before, with the Orne bridgehead still trapped on 3 sides by German forces that refused to yield an inch. July unfolded with grey skies, heavy rain, and deep mud that swallowed boots and slowed every movement across the Orne bridgehead. Yet Cakebread continued his deadly routine with the same discipline he had shown since D-Day, because the sniper war never paused, and every dawn he and his new partner. The day would move out before the light strengthened, crawling into the hedge and setting themselves into the earth like part of the landscape. And they watched, waited, and killed only when the moment demanded absolute precision, and then slipped away before German eyes could find them, and the weeks of wet nights, shallow slit trenches, cold rations, and constant danger turned the commandos into gaunt shadows of the men who had charged ashore on Sword Beach and Cakebread, had lost weight he could not afford to lose, so his uniform hung loose around his shoulders, and his hands grew rough and stiff. Rain and rifle oil, yet his focus remained sharp as ever, and the calm deadly patience he had learned in Wales and in Scotland kept him steady while around him artillery shook the sky each day, and mortar fire shattered the nights, and on July 3rd, Cakebread spotted a German sniper settling into a ruined barn roughly 500 yards from the British lines, and this enemy was skilled and careful, and moved with the practiced confidence of a man who had survived long months of deadly duels, and Cakebread respected him even as he prepared to kill him, because the sniper positioned himself with precision, choosing angles and shadows that would have fooled a lesser hunter, and Cakebread waited with the stillness of stone, because he knew the moment of greatest vulnerability came when a sniper raised his rifle to take a shot, and as soon as the German lifted his weapon and shifted his focus forward, Cakebread fired once, and the round struck the man through the temple and dropped him instantly, and the duel ended before it had begun, and the kill became Cakebread's 23rd confirmed shot, and a reminder that the sniper war inside the Greater War was a relentless battle for survival. And by mid-July, the entire strategic situation in Normandy was changing, because the Americans finally broke through the hedgerows near St. Lo and surged into Brittany, while British and Canadian forces prepared Operation Goodwood, which aimed to smash through the German lines east of Keene. 3 armored divisions and the front that had been static for weeks began to tremble with the pressure of the coming breakout, and for the exhausted men of the Orne Bridge, head good. Wood meant relief was near, because once the new forces pushed through their positions, the commandos and paratroopers who had held this ground since D-Day would finally withdraw for rest and rebuilding. But before that salvation could arrive, the Germans launched intense countermeasures, because they understood that if the British broke through east of Keene, the entire German defense of Normandy would collapse, and so reinforcements flowed into the front as German commanders rushed every available unit forward, including panzer divisions once held back for a decisive attack, and the fighting around the bridgehead surged once more into brutal intensity, and on July 20th, Cakebread was operating near the village of Teuferville when German artillery struck without warning, saturating the open field with high explosive rounds that tore the ground apart in violent bursts, and the pattern of fire walked across the landscape with deadly precision, and Cakebread dove into a crater and pressed his face into the mud as soil, shrapnel, and smoke rained down around him, and the world became a thunderstorm of earth and fire. And when the barrage finally eased, he raised his head and saw Tretcher lying motionless 20 yards away with blood soaking through the torn fabric of his shoulder where a fragment had struck him, and without hesitation, Cakebread crawled across open ground toward him, moving in short bursts, then freezing whenever he sensed German observers might be scanning the fields, and he reached Tretcher and bound his wound with a field dressing, then began dragging him back toward British lines, and the journey took 2 full hours to cover 600 yards as Cakebread pulled his injured partner across mud and shattered earth and shifted from shell hole to shell hole, while his muscles burned and his breath rasped in his throat, and each pause felt like a lifetime as he scanned for movement in the distance. But he refused to abandon Tretcher, and eventually he delivered him to safety, and Tretcher survived, though he was evacuated to England and would not return to the Normandy campaign, and losing Tretcher hit Cakebread with a heaviness that few saw, because in the sniper world, a partner was more than a fellow soldier. He was the keeper of your life and the watcher of your blind spots, and the man who carried half the weight of the silence and yet war allowed no time for grief, so the sniper section assigned Cakebread a new partner within days, and the missions continued because the German positions still needed observing and critical targets still needed eliminating, and the British advance pressed forward, and by early September the breakout across France was well underway, and the 1st Special Service Brigade was finally pulled out of the field on September 7th after 93 straight days of combat stretching from Sword Beach to the pursuit across the Seine, and their casualty list had grown to more than 800 men, nearly 40% of their strength, and Cakebread boarded the transport for England with his rifle slung on one shoulder and his kit bag in his hand, leaving behind the hedges of Normandy and the ruined villages and the silent fields where he had honed the deadly craft that he never expected to possess, and ahead lay a brief period of rest, retraining, and the knowledge that the war was not yet over, and that soon he would be called again to fight and to kill and to survive as only a sniper could. The transport ship reached Southampton on September 8th in the year 1944, and Cakebread stepped onto English soil for the first time in 3 long months, carrying equipment that seemed half the weight it had been on D-Day, because so much had been lost, shattered, or abandoned across Normandy, and what remained was simply his rifle, his ammunition, and the hardened knowledge of a man who had survived one of the most brutal campaigns of the war. And the commandos were moved first to Portrush for processing, then to East Barracks at Southsea, and finally to Bexhill along the Sussex coast, and the sudden return to warm meals, clean uniforms, and beds that actually had mattresses felt unreal after the endless mud, cold, and terror of the bridgehead. And the first night Cakebread slept 14 hours straight and woke confused, reaching automatically for a rifle that was not beside him. And soon replacements arrived to rebuild the shattered ranks, because 45 Commando had gone into France with around 450 men, and fewer than 300 had returned to England, standing in formation as thin, battered survivors, and the empty spaces in the barracks were filled by young volunteers fresh from the Royal Marines Depot who had earned their green berets through training, but had never heard a shot fired in anger. And now they looked at men like Cakebread differently, because he was no longer simply a Marine, but a veteran, someone who had stood in the fire from first day of the invasion and lived long enough to return. And the new recruits asked him questions about what real battle felt like, and they expected stories full of glory and excitement, yet fell silent when his answers described fear waiting and the endless repetition of killing men who had done nothing to him personally except appear in the crosshairs at the wrong moment. And he explained that combat was not the wild, heroic charge shown in papers, nor the kind of dramatic chaos civilians imagined, but instead a long, unforgiving test of patience where every decision held the weight of life and death, and there was no hatred in it, and no thrill, only duty, survival, and the cold understanding that if he did not fire, someone else would die. And the weeks passed slowly as training resumed, with beach landings staged on quiet English shores and rifle drills performed on safe ranges. But exercises felt hollow to men who had already fought through the hedgerows, trenches, and firestorms of Normandy. And everyone knew new orders would come, because the war was still raging across Europe, and Germany was not yet close to surrender. And in January of 1945, those orders arrived, stating that the 1st Special Service Brigade, now renamed the 1st Commando Brigade, would deploy to the Netherlands, where the Allied advance had stalled in the flat, flooded landscape near the Moz River, and where commando units were needed to fight in terrain too difficult for regular infantry. And on January 14th, Cakebread boarded another transport at Tilbury Docks for a crossing that took 18 hours through storm-heavy winter seas, which slammed the ship and hurled loose gear across its decks. And once they reached the port of Ostend, the commandos moved inland through a bleak world of frozen fields, shattered villages, and dark canals where the wind cut through uniforms with knife-like sharpness. And the Netherlands in winter was a new kind of hardship, because the ground was either frozen solid or drowned in icy floodwater, and the soldiers had to fight across open plains where snow turned every shadow into a beacon for enemy marksmen. And the Germans who held these positions had spent 5 years at war and fought now with the desperation of men who understood they were losing everything yet refused to surrender. And 45 Commando was assigned operations around the towns of Mosbury and Broekhuizen, where the enemy had built strong defensive lines along the Montforterbeek, a narrow river that formed a natural barrier to any Allied advance. And on January 23rd, Cakebread moved with a troop as they advanced along the station road toward Mosbury, and the landscape was silent except for the crunch of frozen snow underfoot, until suddenly the Germans opened fire from positions hidden along the dike, and in seconds, the troop was caught in a deadly crossfire, machine guns raking the road from multiple angles and mortar rounds dropping with terrifying accuracy, and men fell screaming or silent. and those who survived threw themselves into ditches, fields, or whatever cover existed while the snow erupted around them in violent bursts of dirt and ice. And somewhere in the chaos, a German sniper found an angle on the exposed commandos and began firing. With lethal precision, and Cakebread crawled into a drainage ditch and raised his rifle, searching the white landscape for the faintest movement. And he eventually spotted a shape in a farmhouse window 200 yards away, where a rifle barrel and telescopic sight shifted against the winter light. And he steadied his breathing, ignoring the cold that froze his fingers, and fired a single shot. And the barrel vanished from the window as the German sniper fell, yet the ambush did not end, because the rest of a troop remained pinned under relentless enemy fire, and wounded men lay in the open field. Crying for help that medics could not reach, and inside a nearby farmhouse, the Royal Army Medical Corps officer Dr. John Tulloch watched the suffering and made a decision that could have easily cost him his life, as he ordered jeeps marked with the Red Cross to drive into the killing zone to retrieve casualties, and the soldiers held their breath, because the entire rescue depended on whether the Germans would respect the rules of war. While machine gun fire and mortars shook the ground, and the jeeps rolled forward toward men trapped in the snow. The jeeps rolled forward under the Red Cross flag, and every man watching held his breath, because no one knew whether the Germans would honor the rules of war or cut them down where they drove through the snow. And for a moment the machine gun bursts softened, though not entirely, as bullets still cracked overhead, while medics rushed into the open and dragged wounded commandos into the vehicles, then raced them back toward safety, and Dr. Tulloch made trip after trip across the killing ground, each run a gamble with fate, and each run proof of the courage required to walk knowingly into fire. And by the end of the rescue, most of the wounded were pulled from the frozen fields, though a troop had been broken by the ambush-losing men, who had survived D-Day, the Orne bridgehead, and the long struggle for Breville, only to die here in the Netherlands 8 months later in snow instead of sand. And Cakebread survived the ordeal and continued to operate as a sniper through that bitter winter, moving across frozen marshes, ruined towns and tight waterways where every shadow looked like a rifle barrel, and every gust of wind felt like a warning, and the German resistance grew fiercer as the Allies moved closer to the borders of the Reich, because many soldiers fought now with nothing left to lose, and the 1st Commando Brigade pushed on, crossing rivers, storming villages, and clearing trenches as the final months of the European war burned toward their end. And by April of 1945, the brigade reached the Weser River and drove east toward the Baltic coast, while entire German divisions collapsed or surrendered or dissolved into scattered pockets of resistance. And yet, even as the war neared its finish, there were still fanatical defenders who refused to yield, and these last battles were fought with the same violence and fear as the earliest ones, and Cakebread continued his work as he had since Normandy, spotting, firing, moving, and watching from the edges of ruined buildings, or the corners of fields where the sight of a helmet or the glint of metal might offer one final target. And when the war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945, he was somewhere in northern Germany, standing in a landscape of broken cities and emptied roads, trying to understand that the gunfire had stopped, and that the silence he heard was not the stillness before another shot, but the stillness of war finally ending. And he had been in combat for nearly 11 months, from the invasion of Normandy through the hedgerows, the sniper duels, the ambushes, the mud, the snow, and the endless nights, and his confirmed tally had risen above 30 German soldiers, placing him among the most effective British snipers of the entire Normandy campaign. And yet there were no medals for someone who worked in shadows and silence, because snipers did not charge machine gun nests, nor lead heroic assaults, nor take ground in ways newspapers could describe, and their success lived in space between heartbeat and breath. In the instant, a single shot ended a life before the enemy knew he was seen, and so Cakebread returned to England with the same rank he had held on D-Day, simply Marine Derek Cakebread, a man who had once cut hair in Tottenham and now carried memories that no civilian chair could ever hold. And he went back to the barber shop where he had spent his early years, and found it still standing, somehow untouched by the bombs that had fallen across London night after night. And his old customers returned, older, grayer, worn by rationing and fear, and they sat in his chair and asked him what the war had been like, and Cakebread did not tell them about the officer he had dropped at 400 yards, nor the sniper he had shot through the temple, nor the truck driver whose death had thrown a convoy into chaos. And he did not speak about the German he watched through a scope for an hour before firing once, nor about the mornings when he lay in a hedge waiting for movement, knowing that the slightest error meant death. And instead he spoke about the rain, the mud, the food, the long marches, and the cold, because these were things civilians could understand. Without breaking the fragile picture they held of war, and decades later, when the Imperial War Museum recorded his testimony, he finally spoke more openly, describing the sniper course at Penley, the brutal training at Chnakari, the endless hours spent waiting for a target to appear, and his voice was calm, steady, the voice of a man who understood what he had done and had accepted its weight and Lord Love. At mentioned him in his memoir March Past, calling him one of the finest snipers in the commando, a hairdresser who had killed more than 30 Germans in Normandy alone, and Cakebread remained anonymous to the world because snipers were meant to be unseen, and the skills that made him deadly were the same skills that once made him a precise, careful, Barber steady, hands patience, attention to detail, and the quiet ability to focus on a single task until it was perfect. And today, 45 Commando still exists, based at Royal Marines Condor in Arbroath, Scotland, and its young Marines train with weapons and technology far beyond anything Cakebread ever imagined, though the core of the craft remains unchanged, because a sniper must still wait, still watch, still breathe slowly, and still trust that one perfect shot can change a battle. And Derek Cakebread lived his life largely unnoticed beyond the war, yet the men he saved and the men he served beside never forgot the quiet Barber who stepped into hell and became a master of the deadliest art on the battlefield. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.